you. This is a little bit funny to talk from up here with so few people here, but we'll just enjoy it. I would rather be down there with you and all of us close together. Also a little funny, we're going to talk about parenting. It looks a little awkward to talk about parenting with not that many parents here, but Kennedy, you're going to be ready for this? You're going to be ready to learn what you need to learn? That's awesome. But we're going to talk about parenting a little bit, and I say a little because I'm going to try not to take the whole time, though we'll see. If it's just you guys, I might take the whole time because I wanted to leave some time for people to ask questions, but if there's nobody to ask questions, then I'll just ask questions of myself. But taking the whole time won't be hard because I like to talk about parenting. In some ways don't love to talk about parenting because it's hard parenting. It's we need you don't want to sound like it's you have all the answers or anything like that. And one of the best ways I think to have good discussions about parenting is just to sit down and have a conversation over a meal rather than just talk from the front like this. But on the other hand, we need to talk about parenting because there's really a lot to talk about. We could spend hours talking about parenting, and we're not going to say everything that we need to say for sure. For one thing, because it's such an important job. I don't think there are many other jobs that are more important than being a parent. We talk about parenting, and we're talking about something that can absolutely change the world. I mean, you want to talk about significant work. When we evaluate work that is significant, what might we use to say this is an important job? Like, what would be the standards? We might say, what's its impact? Or we might look at the skill that's required to do it well. Or we might think about the level of responsibility you're given in that job. Or we might think about what you're doing. And we look at parenting, and we're looking at a job that will change the future, that takes expertise in all kinds of different areas, education, health, finances. In terms of responsibility, is there any bigger responsibility than being responsible for another person, the way you are responsible for your children? If I take my car to the mechanic and I say, hey, fix my car, that's important, but it's just a car. God's like, here's this person. I'm giving you responsibility for this person. That's an important job. And not just jobs, you know. You meet somebody and you say, what's your job? And they say, I'm a teacher, I'm a cook, I'm a nutritionist, I'm a chauffeur, I'm a counselor, I'm a pastor, I'm a coach, I'm a janitor, I'm a stylist, I'm a personal assistant, I'm a daycare worker, I'm a judge, I'm a storyteller, I'm a mediator, I'm a CEO, I'm a security officer, I'm a referee, I'm a financial advisor, and you say, oh, you mean you're a parent? This is a really important job, and it's obviously a difficult one, too, when you look at all that's involved. I mean, it's a great job, so don't get me wrong, because if you know me, you know, I kind of have a problem when people talk about the challenges of parenting in a way that it feels like they're minimizing how wonderful it is to be a parent, because it is a big blessing. So if you want to talk about how good it is to be a parent, there's lots of things you can bring up. You can bring up the friendship you can have with your children, the opportunity to minister, the funny things that you get to watch them say and do, the ability to really help someone in a significant way, the love you have for them, the love they have for you, watching them grow and learn and change, being able to be somebody's fan and celebrate them. There's lots of blessings. That's just kind of the start. But that doesn't mean it's easy. And I'm sure we can make a list of the things that make it challenging as well. You could probably Google parenting is hard quotes and find list after list. And I'm sure every one of us who's a parent has had moments where it feels like you're running a marathon and you don't get a chance for a breath. And so it is difficult. And yet, in spite of how important parenting is and how challenging, when we turn to the Bible, we don't find a lot of passages that speak directly on parenting, where the author's like, okay, hold up, I'm talking to you parents specifically right now. Here's what you do. So there's a few in the Old Testament, the first part of our Bible, but you get to the New, And what does Jesus say directly about parenting? You know, we've got a lot of parenting books, and I'm teaching on parenting, and it's important to do that. But did Jesus ever preach a sermon on parenting? We don't have one that's recorded. It's pretty much only Paul and the writer of Hebrews, if he's somebody different than Paul, that say anything about parenting. And Paul doesn't talk a lot about it, actually. And when he does, he sometimes quotes other parts of the Bible. And he sometimes paraphrases what he said somewhere else. So maybe he adds some things that are new, but not a whole lot, which is interesting, and it makes you wonder why. If parenting is so important, and we believe the Bible contains everything we need for life and godliness, we might wonder, why isn't there a little more in the Bible about parenting? And you could probably come up with a couple different reasons. Maybe in your mind you could try to think of some reasons right now. I think that one possibility is that the Bible says more on parenting than we give it credit for. Because you do what it says in all these other areas, and you focus on obedience there, and you're going to end up being a pretty effective parent. So, for example, I talk about humility. Just because I don't say be a humble dad, that doesn't mean that's not a really important subject for dads. And you apply what the Bible says about humility, and you're going to be a pretty good dad. So that's one answer. But another answer is that we might make parenting more complicated than it is, which might sound a little surprising at first because parenting can feel so hard. But there's a difference between something being hard and something being complicated. Something can be hard and complicated, like figuring out how to get to the moon. Something can be hard and not complicated, like walking 100 miles. Something can be a little complicated, but not that hard, like building Legos or something. And depending on which kind of thing you're doing, you need different kinds of help. When something is complicated, we probably need a lot of different instructions, like real specific step-by-step. When something is just hard, we don't need as many different instructions. We need help to focus on the essentials and to be encouraged. And I think one reason the Bible doesn't say as much as we might expect it to on parenting is because we make it more complicated than it is by really putting a lot of expectations on ourselves as parents that God doesn't. So if you think about ways we might answer the question, like a good parent blank, like how would you fill in the blank? A good parent does this, a good parent does this. There are ways we might fill in that blank where God's like, no, that's not actually your job. And I think that there's a lot of stuff that we might think is vital to being a good parent that God doesn't think is nearly as important. And so we get all worried about finding out answers to things that he doesn't talk about because they're not as significant as we make them out to be. And so he doesn't need to talk about them. And he knows that if he did talk about them and gave us all kinds of instruction on those things, we might get distracted from what really did matter, which he reveals in just a few passages. Which means, of course, that instead of being like, hey, why doesn't he talk about this? Or why doesn't he talk about that? We need to look at the passages where he does talk specifically about parenting a lot more to make sure that we know what he thinks is most important about being a parent. So it's kind of like being around somebody who wrote a book on the subject that you're interested in. And you get a chance to have lunch with him. And yet when he talks about that subject, you're surprised because he doesn't talk about all these things you expected him to talk about. But he just says a few things, and he focuses on a couple areas. What does that tell you? If it's Warren Buffett, you know, I'm sure you could say, Warren Buffett doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to investing. He should have talked about this. He should have talked about that. Or you could be like, I wonder if he knows something that I don't. And the reason that he keeps focusing on these few things is because he believes those few things are really what's most essential. If you have a friend who's kind of one of those worried people and they're doing something new that you've done, and you see that they're all focused on these details that you know are irrelevant or just unnecessary, you would probably tell them, hey, don't worry so much about that stuff until you've got the main things figured out, And then you can think about that stuff if you want, but if you get so focused on that other stuff, you're going to miss out on what actually does matter, which is definitely possible when it comes to parenting. Though it can be hard to see in yourself because you feel like you're focusing on what really, really matters, you know? So it's like if you ever met somebody who's super intense about details. And if the details aren't right, they get so upset and they just get so flustered and they're hard to be around, and you talk to them about it and they're like, well, I'm just a perfectionist. I like everything right. I like to do things well. And you might say to them, if you're really close, if you're really good friends, you might say, that's not true. That's not true. That's not the problem. You're not a perfectionist, because to get these details right, you're treating people wrong. And so you're absolutely not concerned about being perfect in every area. The problem is not that you want to do things well, it's that you're focusing on doing the wrong things well. Your priorities are all out of whack. You should be more concerned about this area than that one. And so we need to know the areas that we should be focused on as parents. And to do that, I want us to look at one of the few passages in the New Testament that speaks directly on parenting. It's the main passage in the New Testament on parenting, and it's Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 4. And I just want to identify two very obvious things Paul says about being a parent here that we don't want to miss, that I think are actually pretty easy to miss, unfortunately, but show us what we really need to focus on. And the first thing is that if you're a parent, number one, God has placed you in a position of authority. I don't know if this is where we would normally begin. It's probably not where I would normally begin when I would talk about parenting, if it were just up to me. But you look at Ephesians 6:1, and Paul clearly assumes it. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long in the land. And usually when we look at that verse, we talk about what it says to children, which makes sense since the first word is literally children. But if Paul says, children, obey your parents, and then he brings up an Old Testament law to back it up like that, and he describes it as a command, that means what? That means children need to do this. So it's not a suggestion. In other words, it's morally right for children to obey their parents. In fact, Paul says that, doesn't he? He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Meaning it's righteous. Not just a good idea, not just helpful, righteous. And that says something about parents, actually. It says that God has placed parents in a position of authority over their children. Because that's kind of what it means to have authority. If I can tell you something that you need to do, and you are morally obligated to do it, that's authority. I've been reading this great book on authority lately, and I want to recommend it to everybody. We're going to work through parts of it as an elder team. It's called Authority, How Godly Rule Protects the Vulnerable, Strengthens Communities, and Promotes Human Flourishing. It's by Jonathan Leeman. And I use a lot of what he says right now, so you can assume some of this comes from thinking about what Jonathan Leeman says about authority. And he begins by saying what authority is not. He says, authority is not power. In other words, authority is not merely having the power to do something. Because when we talk about having the power to do something, we're talking about having the ability or capacity to do something. But when we talk about authority, we're talking about having the moral right to make decisions with that power. So it's authorization to do something. You have authority when you are authorized to do something. You have the right to do something. And to get that difference in your mind, you can think about things you could do versus things you have the authority to do. There's like a million different examples. But if I come to an elders meeting, our elders meeting at our church, and I have an agenda, and I say, guys, I want us to talk about this, and I want us to talk about this, and everybody's like, okay, let's talk about that. But say I go to another church, and I visit their elders meeting, and I bring up an agenda, and I say, I want to talk about this. That's totally inappropriate. I mean, I could try to do that. I have the ability to do that, but I haven't been given the right to do that. And sometimes you're just given that right for a short period of time, and other times you consistently have that right. And generally, when you consistently have that right, it's actually because you've been placed in a particular position. So Jonathan Lehman talks about authority as being like being given an office. And that office is a specific job someone's been given that has particular rights and responsibilities that are connected to that office. So for example, if somebody's a judge, he has a lot of authority in that courtroom. And that doesn't make him better than anybody in that courtroom. It doesn't make him smarter than anybody in that courtroom. It just means that he has a certain job in that courtroom. He has the right and responsibility of making certain decisions in that courtroom that other people don't have. And he doesn't have that authority to do that because of anything that's better than him, than any of the other people there. He doesn't have that authority, for example, because he's really good at making decisions. That's not how he has the authority. How does he have that authority? He has it because a higher authority gave him the right to be the judge and make those decisions in that particular courtroom. So the authority he has is limited to the office of being a judge. It's tied to that. So just because he's a judge and he can say you're guilty and you're going to jail in that courtroom, he can't just go out and do that at the grocery store and have it mean anything. He can't go home and have his children disobey him and he's like, hey, you guys are going to jail. That's just the way it is. I'm a judge. His authority is limited and it's been given to him for a certain purpose. And there are rules to how he can exercise that authority that might even impact what he wears. He has to wear this black robe and what he says and what he does. He can't just go into that courtroom and do everything and people are like, it's okay, I guess he's the judge. We can hold him accountable because there are rules that limit the way that he uses that authority. And I'm saying we can think of being a parent a little bit like that. We can think of being a parent like an office that's given to us. Which means when we say that parents have authority over their children, we don't mean that they're able to tell their children what to do because they're bigger. We don't mean that they get to tell their children what to do because they're smarter or because they're somehow more important. They have authority over their children because God has authorized them to have that authority, which we see in the Ten Commandments when God says, honor your father and mother. And understanding that it's an office given by God to parents is important because it means it's not something that we as parents just deserve inherently. I mean, it makes sense that parents are given this responsibility. It's not random. God is wise. It's not like he's like, hey, I wonder who I should give this position to here in the family. I guess, wow, you look taller. Why don't I choose the parents? But still, it's something given to us, and we need to remember that. We didn't earn this. We've been placed in this position, and it serves a particular purpose. If we think about the book of Ephesians, actually, Paul's talking in Ephesians 6 about parenting, but is he talking about parenting just because it's like, I think that most of you are going to have kids, and so I probably should give you advice on how to do that? No. Really, before you look at Ephesians 6, you should look at Ephesians 1 to 6, and you see Paul starts by talking about this great big thing that God's doing through Jesus and the church, and then he gets into, this is how you should live in a way that matches up with that and makes the gospel look beautiful in this world. And so when he gets to parenting, it's not like, hey, I just want to talk to you about parenting, and I'm certainly not just talking to you about how to be a good person. I'm talking to you now about how to fulfill this mission that God's given the church. As a child in the home, I play a certain part in something bigger than just me and my dad. Like, this is about the glory of God and what he's doing through the church. And as a parent, I play a certain part. I've been given this authority, and I've been given it for a purpose and to fulfill certain responsibilities. And so like with any other kind of authority, there's a job description. If someone becomes a police officer, if someone becomes a teacher, if someone becomes a judge, we say they have authority, but we don't mean they have any authority. We mean they have authority within that job description, which I think is implied when Paul says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, because what he's doing is connecting the children's obedience to their parents, to their relationship to the Lord, which is a way of saying, this child really belongs to the Lord, not to the parent. And so the parent is only a steward. The Lord is the owner. And that means the Lord is the ultimate and final authority over the child and over the parent. And we see in verse 4 that God gives parents commands about their role that they have to submit to as well. So it's not just a free-for-all. That's what I'm saying. Like, parents have authority, children need to obey. So have at it, like tell them to go make you dinner, do the dishes. No, there are limits to the parent's authority because they've been given that authority by somebody else, by God. And when Paul says, children, obey your parents, he doesn't mean, hey, parents, you can tell your children to jump off the roof and they have to do it. You say jump, they say how far. As Jonathan Leeman says, all God-given authority has limits, and that means our responsibility to submit has limits too. And those in positions in authority have responsibilities. They have to submit to God. And as a parent, you need to seek to use the authority the way God says you should use it. And you need to think about, what did he give me this authority for? And what does he say about the way in which I'm supposed to exercise this authority? And we could talk a long time about the way in which we are to exercise authority, because so much of the Bible applies to this. If we just looked at everything that came before this command in Ephesians 6:1 and applied it to our authority as a parent, it would be pretty revolutionary. Like Ephesians 5:1. What does Paul say there? He says to all of us, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. So that's how you are to exercise your authority over your children. That's the manner. And there are all kinds of ways a parent might exercise authority that are not appropriate ways of exercising authority, that are sinful, and they'll be held accountable for because they weren't imitating God. If the parent is not humble, if the parent is overbearing, it's a really big deal. Especially because we know that normally the greater responsibility you have, the more accountability you have. James 3 says that teachers will receive a stricter judgment. Hebrews 13 says leaders give account for people's souls. And parents have been given that role in their children's lives, so we really need to think about how to exercise authority. If the President of the United States doesn't think about his role, if a judge doesn't think about his role, he just shows up. He's like, oh, hey, let's see how this goes today, We'd be like, whoa, man. And being a parent is that kind of influential position, even if you don't want it to be. You can probably imagine some K-drama where the emperor doesn't want to be the emperor. But he is. And if he just decides to act like he isn't, it's still going to have a huge impact on that nation, whether he likes it or not. And so if you decide how you're going to exercise your authority as a parent is by not exercising authority or by using it in a way that's unbiblical, it's going to have an incredibly negative impact on your children. So instead of trying to avoid it, we need to think about how to use it. Again, Jonathan Leeman says, one sign of a civilization in decline is that parents don't know how to exercise authority in their children's lives. They don't require obedience in a clear, firm, and life-giving fashion. Either those parents have been taught that all authority is bad and that they should honor and respect their children's desires, impulses, and true selves, or they have never been trained to use authority well because their own parents didn't model it well. As such, for one reason or another, these parents veer back and forth between abdication and anger, passivity and abuse. And it's easy to be like, and that's a lot of guys, isn't it? They're like passive, 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 blow up! Because they don't know how to use authority. And it's easy to be like, hey, man, what's the problem with all these people out there? I see all these parents, like, you know how to use authority. But the reality is, once you get past the general principles of being like loving and being humble, which are obvious, it can take some work to know what to do because you don't always exercise authority the same way. It's not like, hey, let me give you a list. Here's how to be an authority. Do this every time, and you'll be fine. There's nuance to authority. Please hear that. You've got Samuel just going to Saul and telling him, this is what you have to do. But then you have Nathan coming to David and telling him a story and asking a question. I mean, there are times where you need to command And there are times where you need to encourage. There are times where you need to talk. There are times where you need to shut up. There are consequences. There are times where you need to be patient. There are times where you need to get going. There's just so much to it. I don't know if you ever met somebody in a position of authority who didn't understand that you don't always do the same thing in every situation. Like they got this memo that they think this is the only way I'm supposed to respond when people talk to me. And it can be totally frustrating and super ineffective. Like, hey man, there's like a lot of different situations that come up. You don't always respond to people the exact same way. And so to know how you are going to exercise authority, you've got to think about who are you dealing with. If you treat a 2-year-old like he's an 18-year-old, like you use the same tone of voice, the same vocabulary, the same strategy, that is not a smart way to use your authority. It's like a massive waste of time. You see a parent talking to a 3-year-old like they're 30, and they're having this super long conversation and argument, and the child clearly doesn't have the knowledge the parent has to be in that discussion. And so it's just not helpful for the child, not helpful for the parent. All they are is getting more frustrated than they need to be. But then the opposite, you treat an 18-year-old like he's a 2-year-old, and that is not a smart way to exercise your authority. And you hear parents talking with the same tone of voice to an 18-year-old that they would to a 3-year-old. One thing that has helped me a lot lately is understanding that what is virtuous in one situation is not necessarily virtuous in another situation. So we have to understand, like, the right thing to do in this situation might not be the right thing to do in this situation. So if you're a doctor in charge of doing brain surgery after years and years of training, and you go in and the guy's like, head is open, and you're like, oh, what should we do? Like talking to the person who's sweeping the floor outside. Can you give me an opinion what to do with this guy's head open? And the nurse is like putting her hand in there. She's like, this looks interesting. You're like, okay, it looks good to you. Why don't you give it a try? That's not humble. That's not virtuous. But that doctor goes home, and he's acting the same way he did in that hospital room as he's making dinner with his wife. That's not going to be virtuous either often. And so what you did as a parent that was fine with a 2-year-old is often not going to be fine as you're exercising authority with an 18-year-old. Or if you have a child who's like mentally handicapped and a child who's not, there are certain things about the way you exercise authority with both of them that are going to be similar, but there are certain ways that are going to be different. And it would be super unwise to try to exercise authority with the two of them in the same way. And so you got to think, we all got to think, that's my point, about how we exercise authority. And we also need to think about how or what God has given us that authority for. Because you can use your authority for the wrong thing. In Luke, Jesus talks about this slave who was given authority over the other slaves while his master was away. And Jesus says, if that slave says in his heart, my master will be a long time coming, and he begins to use that authority to beat the male and female servants and to get drunk, the master's going to come back and hold him accountable. Because when he gave him that authority, it wasn't so he could do whatever he wanted to do and just have a nice little comfortable life there in the home. It was to accomplish a certain task. Jonathan Lehman says, when you're given the authority over something, your moral right to make decisions falls inside certain boundaries, or what we might call a jurisdiction. Therefore, when we think about a parent's authority, we need to ask, what is the purpose of this authorization? What is the assigned task? And that question is really important for parents because we've got a lot of power for a while that goes along with our authority. And we use our authority well, and that power enables us to protect our children and help them thrive. But if we use that authority poorly, that power puts them in a really vulnerable position, which is what makes it so ugly when a parent uses their authority poorly. You can imagine maybe a police officer who's been given authority to enforce certain laws. He's got a lot of power. And that can be such a blessing for a community when police officers are using their power properly. But if that police officer starts acting like he can tell anybody what to do, he's like, give me another donut, about anything, it gets scary because he hasn't actually been given that right. And yet he's in that position of power. I remember one time we were in Zimbabwe, And we were waiting at the border, and Zimbabwe was a little bit of a scary place. Not that scary, but a little bit the border because of Mugabe and all that stuff. But I was sitting far away from everybody, just waiting because it was forever. You don't know when you're going to get through that. And a police officer came to me, and he's like, "You can't sit here." And he's like waving his stick at me. And I'm like, "Oh, wow, it's weird. It's just like a curb." And then I'm like, "Where can I sit?" And he points to a place like 2 feet away. And he's like, "Sit there." And there's no signs, there's nothing. And I'm not telling the story perfectly, but it was just an exercise of power, clearly. And I had no idea whether he had the right to tell me that. I don't think so, but I wasn't going to argue because he had the stick. And I'm at the border. And that's no big deal. But it can become a big deal. And most of us know what it's like when someone is not using their authority for what it's for, and we're in a weaker position. It is like a really difficult place to be. Which is why, if God has put you in a position of authority, like a parent, you can't stop with recognizing you have authority. You also need to really think about, what was I given this authority for? Which is the second thing we see in this passage, actually. First, that we have authority, but Paul doesn't only tell children to obey their parents, he tells them why. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first command with a promise, so that it may be well with you, and that you may live long in the land." And so he attaches a promise to that command. And who's that promise from? That promise is from God, which means that what is God doing with this command to obey and this position of authority? God is attaching the good that he wants to do for children. He loves children. He's attaching the good that he wants to do for children, like prosperity and a long life, to the way in which they relate to their parents. And I think that helps us understand one reason why God gave parents authority. It's because God has ways he wants to bless children through the parents' authority. So authority, why does a person have authority? It's for doing good for others. And this is one of the ways the gospel revolutionizes the way we think about authority as parents. Because if we're living for ourselves and we're just thinking about authority, we think, that sounds amazing. How can I use other people being morally obligated to obey me to get what I want? But we look at God as Christians, and how does he use his authority? It's not to get something he needs, but it's to do us good. And actually, this is fascinating. Way back at the beginning of the Bible, he uses his authority to put us as human beings in a position where we can exercise authority, which is amazing. You think about what he made human beings to do. He made us to rule and to exercise dominion. God could have done all that much better by himself. He wouldn't have made any mistakes. He would never have misstepped, Jonathan Lehman says. He never would have exploited or abused people. We often wonder why bad things happen in the world. The answer, in part, is that God decided not to do the whole job of ruling the world himself. Instead, he delegated, he shared, and he continually trains us in the work in the middle of our failures. And staring ahead into eternity shows a similar pattern, a God who will share his rule with his people, world without end and forever. God is a giver, and his authority is for giving. And so God used his authority to give us authority, even though he could have done it so much better, in a sense, without us. And so your authority as a parent is for giving life to others. If you're in authority and you're thinking, how do I hoard it because I just do everything so much better than everybody else, you're not like God. God, he used his authority to give us authority. And so you as a parent have been given this incredible opportunity and placed in this office by God to use your authority to give life to your children. And so this is a different way to think about authority, because we usually think about authority as keeping us from doing stuff that we want. And if the goal of your life is, like, I want to do everything I want at the moment I want to do it, then having somebody in a position of authority of you is kind of a bummer, right? Because they are going to limit you in some ways. But if the goal is to grow and to get better at things and thrive, then the right kind of person being in authority can be a huge help for you, because they can stop you from doing things that are not helpful. They can keep you from destroying yourself through your own sinful desires. They can help you learn to walk on the right path. Jonathan Lehman, again, he says, our natural and short-sighted perspective is to equate authority with restrictions and the repression of growth. So many teenagers will say to themselves, once I'm out of the house, I'll be able to do what I want and become the person I want to be, because we think of authority and freedom or authority and growth as opposites. And there are lots of bad authorities out there that prove that. But the teenager's impulse is not completely wrong either. To possess authority is to possess freedom, the freedom to make decisions or exercise power within a particular domain. And the parent possesses an authority and freedom in the home that the teenager doesn't possess. Indeed, the parent restricts the teenager's freedom in particular ways. Yet the teenager who bucks the arrangement is being short-sighted. The very purpose of those restrictions is to draw the teenager, little by little, into the parent's own freedom and authority, into mature adulthood. A good parent wants the teenager to experience freedom and to exercise authority, but to employ both of those gifts responsibly and morally. So as a parent, you're wanting, God made us all in his image, and so we all kind of start out little kings in a sense, but we don't know how to use that authority well. And so he's given people like parents to help children grow into the kind of people that can be good kings, use their authority well. And in verse 4, Paul gives some specific instructions to parents what to focus on if they're going to do that. And the first is negative. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children. And the second is positive, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And I've talked a lot before about not provoking your children to anger. So if you want to listen to them, we have a few podcasts on that. And it's actually significant to say, hey, you've been given authority. First thing I need to tell you about that is think about your kids and think about how the way you use your authority is impacting them, because you don't want to use it poorly and make it harder for them than you need to. And that was, we've read this verse so often, but that was like really revolutionary back when Paul was writing, to think that fathers could actually do anything wrong with their authority. That just wasn't in the worldview. It's like dad, everything he did was right. But clearly we can use our authority in a way that is seriously damaging and that God hates. And so it's important to know, you're not always getting it right as a dad, even if you're right in terms of, what you're thinking. Because you see your children acting a certain way, and it's super easy to think, man, what is their problem? This is their fault. I'm just trying to help them, when sometimes it really isn't. They're responsible, but you're really responsible. But instead of diving right now into the ways we can make our children angry, or the other is, Colossians says discourage them. So either one. You see a bad leader, people are usually tempted to get angry, or they're tempted to lose heart. But instead of focusing on the ways we can do that, I want to spend the rest of our time just thinking about Paul's command to bring them up, because I think that's the main thing God wants you to use your authority for as a parent. I think that's job number one as a parent, bringing your children up the way that Paul describes, in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And we'll talk more specifically about what that means in a second, but I want to make sure that you know that you can do that. You can bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And I feel like I need to say that because one of the things that I've seen over the years is a swing from one extreme to the other in the way that people think about parenting. Because it used to be that many Christians put a lot of emphasis on what the parent could do. And parents, you'd find them taking all kinds of responsibility on themselves. And sometimes it seemed like they felt like, if I just do this or that the right way, then my kids are going to turn out the way that they should. And that sometimes would become super disappointing when their children got older and they weren't converted, and they could feel all kinds of guilt and be like, oh, I should have woken up on February 3rd and, fed them at the right time. And you want to say to them, hey, man, you're not God here. You can't save your children. There's not a little list of do this, do that, out pops a really great kid. And if they're not, because if they're not saved, all kinds of bad stuff can happen. Sin is literally insane. So like, sin can take people places that you would never expect. And so obviously you can have like this really great, faithful, biblical parent, and the child ends up messing up in a huge way spiritually. And that's really important to understand. Like, say that twice, louder for the people in the back. We say that in our home. Because that has an impact on the way you parent. When you think you can do things that you can't do, you either get proud, or you get desperate, or you get depressed. But you believe what your children really need is a supernatural work of God, and you're going to be praying. You're going to be depending on God. You're always going to be taking your children back to the gospel because you know that's the message God uses to save them. You're going to be thankful for moments where they're doing well, and you realize, this is actually all the Lord. I just praise God. So that's all, super important. But I've kind of been wondering lately if it's not possible that some parents are tempted to make a little bit of a different mistake as they think about all the stuff they can't do in their children's lives. They almost start to talk and act like they can do nothing for their children's spiritual good besides tell them the gospel. So they're like, I heard about this guy. He grew up in a terrible home. He became a Christian. I heard about this other guy. He grew up in a Christian home, and he's an atheist. So what do you do, What do you do? Which is probably something you need to remember when you're around people who are like, you make this mistake, you destroy your children's soul or something. It's like, okay, chill a little bit here. But God did give parents, to children for a reason. And he gives this command to us here for a reason. So deep dive into doctrine for a second, but we've been talking as elders about this doctrine called concurrence, and I'm working through how to say it, so just give me a little bit of a break here, but it's revolutionary for me because when we talk about concurrence, we're talking about how God accomplishes things in this world. And we don't want to think that God just designed the world to work according to certain laws and then he left it as if he's not involved in the middle of all those laws working the way they should. But we also don't want to think that he didn't design the world to work a certain way and everything's just magic, because he did, which is why we can study the way the world works and get better at doing stuff. And that's part of why we have science, of course, but it also applies to something like parenting, in that I know I can't save my children, but I also know God's made the world to work a certain way. And I believe God totally uses means. And while I don't want to overstate what a parent can do, I don't want to understate it either, because there is generally a way God designed this world to work. The book of Proverbs talks about God using wisdom to design the world. And the idea is that he made the world to work according to a certain pattern. And there's like I'm not a woodworker, but like a grain to wood. When you cut according to the grain, it's easier. When you cut across the grain, it's harder or something like that. I don't know, but hopefully that works. But there's a grain to how the world works, a grain to how God designed the world to work. You work according to the grain, it works better. And that's why Proverbs so often is like, hey, you do this and you get blessed. You do this and you have problems. Because that's the way the world normally works. But of course, then Ecclesiastes is like, yeah, but you see the world's broken, right? And then Job is like, hey, you need God you need God's wisdom, because he's got a wisdom that's way higher than ours. You can't figure out everything this way because God's operating at a much higher level. But still, there is Proverbs, and knowing this as parents means that we don't want to take away God's job from him, and we can't. And we recognize we're living in a fallen world, and things don't always work the way they should, and we don't always work the way we should. But we still do think that God normally uses parents. And that's how he designed the world to work. And we want to take our responsibility to bring our children up seriously. Because while we can't save them, we can help them. Or we can hurt them. So for example, you hear about a dad who is like really distant, and he's cold, and he's mean, and he's pretending to be religious. He's like the guy that comes to church. He like talks about God with a deep voice. And yet he goes home and he's incredibly hypocritical. And you got a child growing up in that home. Can that child become a Christian? Praise God, for sure. God's done that. But you know, am I surprised if children growing up in that kind of home often fall away? No, I'm really not. Because I think God designed humans to learn a certain way. And that's not normally the best way for learning to see God for who he is and appreciate the gospel. I think fathers play a big role in how kids learn about God and his authority. And so when there's a dad like that, yes, I totally appreciate how difficult it can be and how normal it would be for the child to become very angry. I remember I had a friend who became a Christian after somebody invited him to a charismatic church by saying, "I'll buy you a beer afterwards." And I hear that, and I'm like, that's how you should do it. No, that's not how you should normally do it. That's shocking. I'm glad God used it. But I'm not going to do it that way. That's not normally the best way for witnessing. And as a parent, you know, I want to focus on doing what I can do that I know honors God and normally would put my children in the best position to benefit from the gospel and have a relationship with God and live in a way that honors him. That's how I want to use my authority. And one of those ways is to help them develop certain habits. So they're like habits that you can develop that they don't, certainly, they're not what save you, but they certainly make it, well, let me give you an example. It's hard to say it exactly right, but to believe the gospel, I need to hear the gospel. To hear the gospel, I need to listen to it. And so, can someone listen to the gospel and be saved who's not a good listener? Yes, of course. But if I help my children develop the habit of being a good listener to God's word, I'm then giving them a skill that I know God has often used to change people's lives. And I think there are a lot of examples like that as well. I'm teaching my younger children how to speak kindly, how not to speak. And they're not converted. But still, I bring them back to God. I'm like, your words belong to God. You were made for God's glory. These kinds of words don't glorify God. These kinds of words do. And I try to give them an example to imitate. And I think that kind of practice is important for them, even though they're not believers, because it's right. It's how you should talk to people. And because they're learning to do the right thing, it's becoming a habit. And I believe it will make it easier to have beneficial conversations with them as they get older about the gospel if they know how to speak to me and they know how to speak to the people around them as a habit, and because they're being taught to think the right way as well. And I have a responsibility to teach them to think a certain way. Like, I need to teach them to think because they come out of the womb fools, right? Sorry, that was me too. Like, we all come out fools. That's why God gives us parents. And so you don't just say, oh, that, I'll let you think the way that you want to think. No, that's a foolish way to think. And I think, actually, Paul's emphasizing the importance of parents teaching their kids how to think here, because he says, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So that's how to bring them up. And that doesn't mean spank them and then give them a good sermon afterwards. Because discipline here means educate. It's the second half of the word for encyclopedia. It's educating. And when he talks about educating, he's talking about teaching them a whole way of looking at the world. That's what a parent's job is. So what you want to do is give them a biblical worldview. That's what I want to do with my kids. I want to give them a biblical worldview. And guys, hear me now, because I'm not just talking about teaching them a couple Bible verses. That's not a biblical worldview. You can quote a lot of Bible verses and have an unbiblical worldview. I'm talking about teaching them a whole way of looking at the world. So as a parent, I realize, even growing up in my home, the whole world, there's like the air we breathe out there is teaching me and my kids a way of looking at the world. And so when you grow up in a certain place, the world is training you how to think about things This is where people come from. This is what people are for. This is the purpose of life. This is the problems with the world. This is how you can fix them. This is where you should be putting your hope. And Paul is saying, as parents, we can't just let that process happen to our child. We need to take primary responsibility and help shape our children to think biblically about their lives in this world. That's what it means to bring them up in the discipline of the Lord. That's actually education. So just be careful that you're not giving your children to somebody else to teach them a worldview that's not God's, without at least helping them, because that's your job, is to teach them a biblical worldview. And every time you teach history, you understand, every time you teach any subject, it's not just the facts that people are teaching, it's an interpretation of the world that they're teaching. And you need to be doing that. You need to be helping them develop that. And then the second term he uses in this verse is instruction, and that's a term that's often used to describe biblical counseling. It's the word nouthetic, which is one of those words that are two words squished together, mind and put. So it means to put in somebody's mind. And Paul's saying, fathers, you need to put truth in your children's mind. And when he says fathers, I'm sure it means mothers too at some level, but maybe he's saying fathers because he knows it's easy for us to be so passive and miss out on our responsibility. But this has to do with sitting down and talking to your child about the truth and how it applies to their lives. So not just generically, but hey, this is what's true. This is what it looks like to live in line with that. And if you wonder, where would I start to teach my kids that? The Bible gives us a whole book to show us. The book of Proverbs. So study that, and you'll see all kinds of things you need to put in your child's mind, like the fear of the Lord, proper attitude towards God, wisdom, and valuing it. Choices have consequences, purity and self-control, how to talk, how to treat others, how to pick their friends, how to work, how to handle money. Which I know sounds like a lot, and it is hard work for sure. But honestly, maybe a little less complicated than we sometimes make it, especially when we're making all this other stuff out there that everybody's telling us we need to focus on more important than God does. Yeah, that would get tiring if they got to the only way to have a good kid is they have to do 700 different sports at the highest level. And I'm tired. But God's work that he's given us is it's hard, but it's a little less complicated than that. He gives us a really important job, and the basics are pretty simple to being a parent. You've been given a position of authority in your child's life for their good, and you need to learn how to use that in a way that brings them joy and moves them towards maturity. And you do that by bringing them up and giving them a biblical worldview, doing everything you can to help them sort of see the world and themselves the way that God sees it, and then getting involved in the nitty-gritty of their life and helping them to think about what does it look like to think and live like Jesus in every moment. And so I was going to give you 15 minutes, but I gave 8 at the end, and I don't know if anybody has any questions or thoughts in response to what we've had to say about being a parent. Levi, you got anything? No, it's okay. A few more years, yeah. You will someday. Yeah. Yeah. So it's pretty neat, again, come back to authority. There's different ways we exercise authority. So again, I really want to say that loud and clear. Sometimes people hear authority, they think there's only one way to do it. No, a wise person knows that I exercise authority differently in different situations and with different people. There's also, in the Bible, there's authority of command and there's authority of counsel. And so what that means is there's certain kinds of authority that you can they have the right to discipline you if you don't obey. And there's other kinds of authority that don't have that right. The other person is morally obligated to obey you, but you don't have the right to discipline them.
So the government has the authority that the Bible actually, they bear the sword, so they have a authority that when it's exercised properly in its limits, they can actually discipline. Parents at a certain level have that authority. Husbands don't have that kind of authority. They have the authority of counsel. Their wives are morally obligated to listen and submit, but the husband doesn't have anything he can do in terms of obviously disciplining or something like that. It's authority of counsel. So when your child is growing up when they're young, part of I think what the blessing is you have the authority of command, and they're really dependent on you for almost everything. And so the more dependent they are on you, and the less they know, the more for their good you're going to have to, it's always for their good and for their life, the more you're going to have to think about direct counsel and discipline that's going to help them learn the habits of actually obeying. As they grow older, though, your goal is not to keep them a child that you've got to stand in front of and say, do this, do that. In a sense, you want to move away from that. Like, you want to see them be able to use authority well. You want to see them be able to exercise freedom. You're not hoarding, like, so I love things, love having this family my way, I just know everything, so that's why I'm telling my kids what to do. You're using that authority for their good in the beginning, because if you don't use your authority like that, they're going to pick up, like, something from the ground and stuff it in their face and die. Like, you've got to use your authority to help them develop the habits to be able to live. But as they grow older, you're moving more and more towards authority of counsel. So it's like in the beginning, because they're becoming less and less dependent on you, because they're learning how to think more and more clearly about the world because you've been teaching them that, because you know that part of how you learn and grow is by making choices that have consequences and saying, okay, wow, that didn't work out well. I need to make this choice. And so you're trying to move them toward the position where they can really be doing all of this well themselves. And you don't do that by spending your whole life following them, say, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. Now you realize, okay, I need to be a parent who's bringing them up. I'm taking them somewhere. And so really, I think the less and less dependent they become on you, the more you're moving from authority of command to authority of counsel, which is, and so somebody's described it like this, like you're starting off life here as a parent and your child's here, you're in front of them, then you're moving to beside them, and then the goal is kind of to get behind them so you can help them launch. And so, so the more dependent they are on you, the more they prove to be dependent on you, the more authority of command you need to exercise. And the less dependent they are on you, the more you're just thankful they have the opportunity to just help them thrive by using your authority differently. But from the beginning, it's so important, like your authority, God, like, I just love that thought, like, because I've sometimes thought, man, I made a mistake by giving people too much opportunity. And not so much with parenting, but with other ways of leadership. And then I realized, man, God, from the beginning, like when he created us, he put us in the position where to exercise authority. And that certainly made everything a lot more complicated, the way we use that authority. And so there's something, I think, beautiful about wanting to use your authority to give somebody else the opportunity to thrive. And that carries with it risk for us. And yet, I think that we need to take that risk as best as we can. And it will make our lives more complicated sometimes. I'm thinking about better ways to say that, so I'm going to keep working on it. But I think you're always thinking, again, I'm going to say the same thing again, but like you're always thinking about, how do I use this for this person's good? So when they're older, me just telling them everything to do, I know long-term is not good for a human being. You know, like I can't follow them around my whole life telling them what to do. And that's not a beautiful way to live. I want them to be somebody who thinks biblically. Anyway, okay. Yeah. So yeah, I really would pick up that book, Authority. He works through a parent's authority. He works through a husband's authority. He works through the government's authority. Yeah. Okay, good. She's asking, is that idea of authority of command and authority of counsel from that book by Jonathan Leeman? And I said, yeah, it is. That'd be a great book to pick up. For me, I'm being revolutionized. I realize my way of thinking is really being helped because I understand that I actually don't think I thought about submission super well throughout my life, and have more thought about, like, it would be so much better if everybody was just able to do what they're supposed to do without anybody telling them, or not anybody being in a position of authority over them. And so, recognizing that actually the way God designed the world to work, somebody lining themselves up under somebody else's idea and using their resources to help accomplish that idea is not completely a negative thing. So for me to submit to somebody else seems easier, but for me to ask somebody else to submit to my idea, that feels very awkward. And yet, God has given people positions of authority for the good of others. And it really helps me to realize that, like, everybody's on the same level at creation. So it's not like this person's in a position of authority because he's so much smarter. It's just this is how God's designed the world to work. And so when a person in a position of authority is so afraid of authority, like, and rightfully so, because, like, some guys are so wacky using it for, like, whatever, that's, like, so ugly. But the easy response is to be like, oh, just let everybody do their own thing, you know, and, like, just make a suggestion, and if they do it, cool. If they don't do it, cool. That would be kind of I'll just keep doing it myself. But to realize that, oh, no, if God's put a person in a position of authority, they need to be super wise and gracious and not make all kinds of dumb mistakes and sin in the way they use that authority. So there's lots of warnings over there, but some of us need to just be reminded that, like, no, God put you in that position, so for you to just not be comfortable with anybody submitting, that's not actually in the flow of how God made the world to work and people to thrive. So that probably needs a lot more conversation, because it's just getting in my head now, and realizing, I've got more to think about when it comes to that, because I can feel like some of my instincts are wrong. It's easy when it comes to, like, something straight from the Bible, because then it's just clear, like, say that. That's not even anything to do with me. But it's a little trickier when it comes to, like, ideas about applying the Bible or, like, ways to go. Then it can easily start feeling uncomfortable because so many people use authority just to advance their own agenda. That it's like, I don't ever want to be one of those guys who's using authority to advance his own agenda, because what's my agenda? It's got nothing better than anybody else's agenda, probably worse than a lot of people's agenda. So it's, like, so scary that it's easy to be like, never. But you realize, no, God has put people in positions of authority. So, and he does talk about submission, and this is what submission is. So it must not be something that is inherently off or wrong. It must be just something that we have to be super careful about. And it's true, often the better something is, the more for people, the more potential there is for it to damage people. So any good thing, Satan's going to love to get in there and just, like, twist God's design, because it's got such power to, like, blow people up. And so, anyway, thanks, guys. It was good to chat.